Australia's first ever moon rover has been enlisted for a NASA-led mission to gather information on the surface of the moon. The Australian-built rover will be on the CT4 mission, scheduled to travel to the moon by the end of the decade. It's set to study the composition of lunar soil. This will help global efforts to establish a potential sustainable human presence in space. And for more on this, I'm joined by Swinburne University astronomer Dr Rebecca Allen. Good morning, welcome to the program.
Hi there.
Tell me, just how important is this development?
Well, we know now where the rover will be making its debut on the lunar surface, and that's so important because we're in the final stages of designing the key elements for the rover. And so knowing where it's going to go and what conditions it's going to be facing are really important elements.
So what can you tell us about where it will go and just what those conditions will be?
So rover is headed to the south pole of the moon, and we know that this is an important region because for decades, scientists have believed that there is water ice trapped in what we call permanently shadowed regions of the moon. Now, water, of course, is a critical resource for crewed missions that will have a long presence on the moon, but it's also useful for other things such as fuel. So knowing that there's a potential for an access to this resource, which we won't have to really kind of dig up and process a lot, is really attractive. However, the lunar south pole is riddled with craters, some of which are meters and tens and hundreds of meters tall. So accessing that water could be quite challenging. This is why it's so important to send these robotic spacecraft to go and investigate those regions.
And from what you know so far, do you reckon rover's got what it takes?
Absolutely. We're seeing Australia's best and brightest come together. Over 20 universities and organizations headed by EPE who have a legacy in really dealing with these very intense extreme conditions, powered by Lunar Outpost Oceana, who, again, they come from the American company, and so there's a track record of space technology. So I'm really, confident that with this combined expertise that we're going to see a great first for Australia.
And when you talk about this area that's in shadow, is this what's sometimes referred to as the dark side of the moon that doesn't get that access to the sun?
Look, that's a great question. Actually, the dark side of the moon is what we actually refer to as the far side of the moon. And while the moon appears to present the same face to us the whole time on Earth, and that's why we say that, it actually is rotating in exactly the same timing as it orbits around the Earth, so we never really get to see that other side. When we talk about permanently shadowed regions, these are ones that, because of the direction of the sunlight and where the shadow is cast, they've never received sunlight, we believe, in the entire history of the moon. So we're seeing water that could have potentially accumulated here that has been there for billions of years.
In addition to that water or ice, depending on the circumstances in that area, is there anything else that you think you might find in this area?
Well, it's a really great question because we know from research that's been done that across the lunar surface, the distribution of key resources and things like silicates, and of course we need iron and metals to build things, it's not an even distribution. So understanding too, in a region where there's much more cratering, what has actually made it to the surface, and that's, of course, as an astronomer, that's exciting because we're going to get a peek into some of that lunar geological history, but then also seeing kind of what's been brought to the surface and what minerals and resources could be there. Again, we've only seen very little kind of evidence and results from the Indian rover, and so there's still a lot more we need to understand.
And how will all of that information impact potentially crewed operations to, or some sort of more stable and ongoing base, for lack of a better term, on the moon?
Sure. Well, we know humans, we're going to need a lot of resources if we're going to survive there long term and kind of set up a base. So things like critical resources, like we said, water for drinking and creating other byproducts, but also things like, we're investigating how lunar regolith can be used to actually make some of the structures that we might need. And also understanding the effects of lunar dust. We know that this is really nasty. This is something that even came out of the Apollo missions. It's bad for people. people, it's bad for machinery. So how can we actually use some of that Australian ingenuity to think of new ways for actually repelling that dust and mitigating those effects so that we know that any equipment is going to last longer and that people are going to be safer. Radiation, of course, is also a major factor, and one thing that we're kind of pleased to see about a mission that's going to be later in the decade is when the sun is going to be approaching a solar minimum. So hopefully that will mean less intense radiation, and it will give us really this kind of baseline for understanding those conditions on the surface.
Well, certainly some exciting times ahead. Dr Rebecca Allen, Swinburne University astronomer, thanks so much for your company this morning.
Of course.